All right, let's dive into something a little different today. We're going to be talking about Michael Haneke, and he's not exactly known for his lighthearted films. So buckle up, folks. We're in for a bit of a ride, but it's going to be a fascinating one, I think. I've been looking through the material you sent me, and I'm really struck by the fact that he's not just a director; he's a writer too, and you really see that in his films.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can tell that he's really thinking about every single frame, every single line of dialogue. He's not just trying to entertain you, he's trying to make you think. He's trying to provoke a reaction.
Yeah, and it's funny because I was reading this interview with him, and he said something like, I'm not interested in giving answers. I'm interested in asking questions. And that really resonated with me
Mm.
because I think that's what makes his films so powerful.
It's true. He doesn't give you any easy answers. He leaves you with more questions than you started with. And that can be frustrating, but it can also be really rewarding.
Yeah, and I think it's also what makes his film so relevant because we're living in a time where we're constantly bombarded with information. And it's hard to know what to believe. So it's refreshing to see a filmmaker who's not afraid to say, hey, I don't have all the answers. Let's explore this together.
Yeah, exactly. He's not afraid to be ambiguous. He's not afraid to leave things open to interpretation.
And, I was thinking about his background, too, the fact that he studied philosophy and psychology.
Oh, yeah, that's so important to understanding his work.
Yeah, because it gives him this unique perspective on human nature.
Right. He's not just interested in telling stories. He's interested in exploring the human condition, the dark side of human nature, the things that we don't like to talk about.
And he's not afraid to make us uncomfortable.
Oh, absolutely not. He's a master of discomfort.
I mean, think about some of his films like Caché or Funny Games. Those films just get under your skin.
Yeah, they're not easy to watch, but they're impossible to forget.
Yeah, and I think that's because he's tapping into something primal,
Some deep-seated fear or anxiety that we all have.
and he's not afraid to exploit that.
But he's not doing it in a gratuitous way. He's doing it in a way that's thought-provoking and ultimately, I think, illuminating.
Yeah, I agree. So how does he do it? What are some of the techniques he uses to create this sense of unease? Because when I think of Haneke, I immediately think of those long, still shots, that sense of stillness that almost feels like it's sucking the air out of the room.
Yeah, he's definitely a master of that. Those long takes, the static shots, it's like he's daring you to look away, but you can't because you're so drawn into what's happening on screen.
It's like he's saying, pay attention. This is important.
Yeah, and the way he uses silence, too.
Oh, the silence is deafening in his films.
It's so effective because it creates the sense of anticipation, this feeling that something is about to happen,
And then it doesn't.
or it does, but it's not what you're expecting.
And it just leaves you feeling so unsettled.
Yeah, it's brilliant.
And then there's the dialogue, or rather the lack of dialogue.
Yeah, he's very sparing with his words.
It's like every word is carefully chosen.
Every pause, every silence, it all means something.
It's like he's saying, I'm not going to spell it out for you. You have to figure it out yourself.
Exactly. He trusts his audience. He knows that we're smart enough to fill in the blanks.
And that's a rare quality in a filmmaker these days.
It is, and it's one of the things that I admire most about Haneke.
So let's talk about some of the specific films that you've chosen for this deep dive, because I think each one of them is a masterclass in Haneke's unique style. We've got Caché, Amour, The White Ribbon, Funny Games, and The Seventh Continent. 5 films that span his entire career, and each one of them is a punch to the gut in its own way.
Yeah, they're not for the faint of heart,
Yeah.
but they're essential viewing for anyone who wants to understand the power of cinema and the dark side of human nature.
Okay, so let's start with Cash, which I think is a perfect example of how Haneke uses ambiguity to unsettle the viewer.
Yeah, it's a brilliant film, and it's so relevant to our current moment.
Yeah, how so?
Well, it's a film about surveillance, about the ways in which we're constantly being watched.
And about the paranoia and suspicion they can create.
Exactly. And it's also a film about the past, about how the past can come back to haunt us.
In ways that we never expect.
Right.
And the film never reveals who's sending the tapes.
Mm.
And that just adds to the feeling of unease.
It makes you question everything and everyone.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder, how much control do we really have over our lives?
That's a great question, and it's one that Haneke doesn't answer for us.
And I think that's the point.
He wants us to grapple with these questions ourselves.
And to come to our own conclusions. So Caché is all about surveillance, guilt, and the lingering impact of the past. And it's a film that's become even more relevant today than it was when it was released in
Oh,
2005.
absolutely. It's a film that speaks to our current anxieties
Mm-hmm.
about privacy, about security, about the world we live in.
And it does it in a way that's both brilliant and unsettling. Okay, so that's Caché. Let's move on to Amour. Now, this is a very different film from Caché. It's a love story, but it's a Haneke love story.
Yeah, so don't expect any hearts and flowers.
Right.
This is a film about the realities of aging, about the challenges of facing mortality,
And about the enduring power of love.
even in the face of unimaginable suffering.
Yeah, it's a tough film to watch. But it's also incredibly moving
And it's a testament to Haneke's range as a filmmaker.
that he can make a film about love.
Hmm.
That's just as unsettling as his films about violence and paranoia.
Absolutely. He's a master of his craft,
And he's not afraid to explore any subject matter.
no matter how difficult or challenging it might be.
So we've got Caché, which is about surveillance and guilt, and Amour, which is about love and mortality. Two very different films. But both of them are classic Haneke.
Yeah, they both have his signature style, those long takes, the static shots, the silence.
The ambiguity,
And they both leave you with a feeling of unease.
and a lot to think about. Okay, so let's move on to The White Ribbon, which is a film that I find particularly disturbing.
Yeah, it's a tough one.
It's set in a small German village on the eve of World War I.
And it's about the roots of violence and the ways in which societal pressures can foster cruelty.
And it's shot in this stark black and white.
That just adds to the feeling of dread.
Yeah, it's like you're watching a nightmare unfold.
And the thing that's so disturbing about it is that the violence is never really explained.
Right.
We don't know who's doing it or why,
And that makes it all the more terrifying.
because it suggests that the violence is coming from within.
From the very fabric of society.
Yeah, it's like Haneke is saying, that we're all capable of evil.
Given the right circumstances,
And that's a pretty unsettling thought.
it is. And it's one that I think is particularly relevant today when we're seeing so much division and hatred in the world.
Yeah, it's a film that makes you question the very nature of humanity.
And the forces that shape our behavior. Okay, so we've got Caché, which is about surveillance and guilt. Amour, which is about love and mortality. And The White Ribbon, which is about the roots of violence. Three very different films, but all of them are united by Haneke's unique style and his willingness to confront the dark side of human nature.
Yeah, he's not afraid to make us uncomfortable. He's not afraid to challenge our assumptions.
And he's not afraid to leave us with a lot of unanswered questions.
And that's what makes him such a great filmmaker.
Okay, so let's move on to Funny Games, which is probably Haneke's most controversial film.
Yeah, it's a real mind-bender.
It's a home invasion thriller, but it's also a meta-commentary on the nature of violence in cinema.
Yeah, he's constantly breaking the fourth wall, talking directly to the audience, challenging us to confront our own complicity in the violence that we're watching on screen.
It's like he's saying, you want violence, I'll give you violence, but I'm going to make you think about it.
Yeah, and he does it in a way that's both disturbing and hilarious.
Yeah, it's a really strange film because you're never quite sure how to react to it.
Right. You're laughing 1 minute, and then you're cringing the next.
And the whole time you're thinking, what is Haneke trying to say here?
And that's the beauty of it. He doesn't give you any easy answers.
It just presents you with this puzzle.
And lets you figure it out for yourself.
And I think that's what makes Funny Games such a powerful film.
It's a film that stays with you long after you've seen it,
And it forces you to question your own relationship with violence.
both in cinema and in real life.
Okay, so we've got Caché, which is about surveillance and guilt. Amour, which is about love and mortality. The White Ribbon, which is about the roots of violence. And Funny Games, which is about the nature of violence in cinema. Four very different films. But all of them are united by Haneke's unique style and his willingness to confront the dark side of human nature.
Yeah, he's a filmmaker who's not afraid to push the boundaries
And to make us uncomfortable.
and to make us think.
Okay, so let's move on to our final film, The Seventh Continent, which is Haneke's debut feature.
Yeah, it's a really interesting film because it's so bleak and uncompromising.
Yeah, it's about a family who decides to systematically dismantle their lives.
I can commit suicide.
Yeah, it's a tough watch.
But it's also a very powerful film, and it lays the groundwork for many of the themes that Haneke would explore in his later work.
Like alienation and despair
Yeah.
and the spiritual emptiness of modern life.
Exactly.
And it's based on a true story.
Which makes it even more disturbing.
Yeah, it's a film that really gets under your skin.
And it makes you think about the choices that we make in life.
And the consequences of those choices.
And it also makes you question the very meaning of existence.
Yeah, it's a heavy film.
But it's also a brilliant film.
And it's a testament to Haneke's talent.
That he was able to make such a powerful film right out of the gate.
Yeah, it's a film that announces the arrival of a major cinematic voice.
And it's a film that still resonates today.
So we've talked about these 5 films: Caché, Amour, The White Ribbon, Funny Games, and The Seventh Continent. Each one of them is a masterpiece in its own way. And each one of them is a testament to Haneke's unique vision.
Yeah, he's a filmmaker who's not afraid to challenge us, to make us uncomfortable, to make us think.
And I think that's why his films are so important.
Because they force us to confront the dark side of human nature.
And to question our own assumptions about the world.
And ultimately, I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, I agree. Because if we're not willing to confront the darkness, then we're never going to be able to find the light.
Well said.
So Michael Haneke is a filmmaker who's not for everyone, but he's a filmmaker who's definitely worth exploring.
Absolutely.
And if you're willing to take the journey,
you'll be rewarded with some of the most challenging and thought-provoking cinema ever made.
Okay, so we've talked about Haneke's films, but I'm also curious to hear your thoughts on his impact on the broader cinematic landscape, because I think it's safe to say that he's one of the most influential filmmakers of our time.
Oh, absolutely. He's a true auteur.
And his influence can be seen in the work of so many other filmmakers.
Yeah, he's inspired a whole generation of directors who are interested in exploring the darker side of human nature and pushing the boundaries of cinematic storytelling.
And his films are studied in film schools all over the world.
Yeah, he's considered a master of the craft.
So what is it about his work that resonates so deeply with other filmmakers?
Well, I think it's his honesty, his willingness to show us the world as it is, without any sugarcoating.
Yeah, he's not afraid to be bleak.
Or uncompromised.
And I think that's refreshing.
Especially in a world where we're constantly bombarded with happy endings and feel-good stories.
Yeah, Haneke's films are a reminder that life is not always a fairy tale.
And that sometimes. The truth is more disturbing than fiction.
But I think there's also a certain beauty to his films.
Yeah, they're beautifully crafted.
And they're full of these haunting images.
That stay with you long after you've seen the film.
And I think that's part of what makes them so powerful.
Yeah, they're not just films that you watch, they're films that you experience.
And that you think about for days afterwards.
Exactly.
So Michael Haneke is a filmmaker who's not afraid to challenge us, to make us uncomfortable, to make us think. And I think that's why his films are so important.
Because they force us to confront the dark side of human nature.
And to question our own assumptions about the world.
And ultimately, I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, I agree. Because if we're not willing to confront the darkness, then we're never going to be able to find the light.
Well said. And I think it's that honesty that really resonates with other filmmakers, too.
Yeah, I can see that. He's not trying to please anyone. He's just trying to tell his truth.
Exactly. And he's not afraid to be controversial.
Yeah, he definitely doesn't shy away from difficult subjects.
And I think that's what makes his films so compelling.
Because they're real.
They're raw, they're unflinching.
And they force us to confront the things that we'd rather ignore.
Yeah, like the dark side of human nature.
The violence, the cruelty, the hypocrisy.
The things that we all know exist, but that we don't like to talk about.
And I think that's one of the things that makes Haneke such an important filmmaker.
Because he's forcing us to have these conversations.
Yeah, he's not letting us off the hook.
He's making us confront our own complicity.
In the world that we live in.
And I think that's a good thing.
It is. Because if we're not willing to confront these issues, then we're never going to be able to solve them.
Exactly.
So Michael Haneke, a filmmaker who's not afraid to make us uncomfortable. A filmmaker who's not afraid to challenge us. A filmmaker who's not afraid to make us think.
And a filmmaker who's left an indelible mark on the world of cinema.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. So we've talked about Haneke's films, and we've talked about his impact on other filmmakers. But I'm also curious to hear your thoughts on his legacy. Like, what do you think his lasting impact on cinema will be?
That's a good question. I think it's still too early to say for sure, but I think it's safe to say that he's one of the most important filmmakers of our time.
Yeah, I agree.
And I think his films will continue to be studied and debated for years to come.
And I think his influence will continue to be felt.
In the work of other filmmakers.
And I think that's a good thing.
It is.
Because it means that his work is still relevant.
And it means that he's still making us think.
So, Michael Haneke, a filmmaker who's not afraid to make us uncomfortable. A filmmaker who's not afraid to challenge us. A filmmaker who's not afraid to make us think.
And a filmmaker who's left an indelible mark on the world of cinema.
And a filmmaker whose legacy will continue to inspire and provoke us.
For generations to come.
Well said. I think that's a good place to leave it for today.
Yeah, I agree.
But before we go, I just want to say thank you for taking this deep dive with me.
It's been a pleasure.
And I hope you've enjoyed our exploration of the work of Michael Haneke.
I have. It's always fascinating to talk about his films.
It is. Because they're so rich and complex.
And they always leave you with something to think about.
Exactly. So, until next time, keep watching.
And keep thinking. It's funny, because people often describe Haneke's films as being cold or distant.
Yeah, I've heard that too, like they're emotionally detached.
But I actually think there's a deep well of empathy running through his work.
Interesting. So where do you see that empathy?
Well, I think it's in the way he observes his characters.
Okay.
He doesn't judge them, even when they're doing terrible things.
Right, like in funny games.
Exactly. He just presents them to us, flaws and all.
Yeah, and lets us draw our own conclusions.
And I think that's a very empathetic way of approaching storytelling.
It is, because it acknowledges the complexities of human nature.
Right. That we're all capable of both good and evil.
And that there's often a gray area between the two.
Absolutely. And I think that's something that Haneke's films really capture.
That moral ambiguity.
Yeah. And it's something that I think we can all relate to.
Because we've all been in situations where we've had to make difficult choices.
Where the right thing to do isn't always clear.
And I think that's what makes Haneke's films so thought-provoking.
Because they force us to confront those difficult choices.
And to think about the consequences of our actions.
And I think that's a valuable thing.
It is. Because it can help us to become more compassionate and understanding people.
Exactly. So yeah, I think Haneke's films are actually very empathetic.
I never thought of it that way before, but I can see your point.
They're not always easy to watch, but they're always rewarding.
Yeah, I agree. They make you think.
And they make you feel.
And sometimes they make you squirm in your seat a little bit.
Oh, absolutely. But that's part of the fun.
It is. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today.
We have.
From surveillance to guilt, love and mortality, the roots of violence, the nature of violence in cinema, and even the meaning of existence.
It's been a whirlwind tour through the mind of Michael Haneke.
It has. And I've learned a lot.
Me too.
So thank you for taking this deep dive with me.
It's been a pleasure.
And to our listeners, if you haven't seen a Michael Haneke film yet, I highly recommend checking one out.
Just be prepared to be challenged.
And maybe even a little bit disturbed.
But ultimately, I think you'll be glad you did.
Absolutely. So until next time, keep watching and keep thinking.